Hi guys, so today's video is going to be a look at some different book covers that look very similar. These are books that at first glance, whenever I see them at the bookstore, I always think it's a different book. I always am mistaking it for something else. And I would love to know if all of you have noticed these same ones before. Maybe you've never noticed this, but now that I'm going to be pointing it out, you're like, oh my gosh, that does look really similar. And to be clear before I jump into it, I'm not talking about books within the same series, like All the Stars and Teeth and All the Tides of Fate that have a very obvious similar look to them with just a little bit of variation. I'm not talking about, say, something like fantasy where we have a sword on the cover or something a little bit generic. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about books that have nothing to do with each other, but they look like they should. I'm going to start with not just 2 books, but 3 books that I feel like are definitely following a very similar trend. The colors that they pick are not necessarily the exact same colors, but I feel it comes from a similar color palette. And the imagery and the font style, it's all really similar. Those books would be What's Mine and Yours, The Vanishing Half, and then The Prophets. They all have the exact same sort of imagery where you have the profile and they're sort of stacked on top of each other. I feel that this is a slightly abstract image to have, and to have 3 different books have this similar style, it's strange that this has become a trend, because there are certain images that I think are fairly generic that you expect from certain genres. So for example, I always say I'm a sucker if you have a tree or a bird on the cover, and those appear on covers often, which we will look at some with trees. But either way, there are certain things you expect. Like I said before with fantasy, sometimes you'll see a sword on the cover or a knife or something like that. But this is not something that I would think would be on a lot of covers. Like let's have stacked profiles of people's faces with kind of muted colors that are a little more pastel-like, and then let's have really similar font too. Like they're kind of softer around the edges. The Prophets, I would say, is not as soft. It's a little bit more bold, but the other 2, The Vanishing Half and What's Mine is Yours, have a softness to the edges of the font. I apologize for anybody that's a professional in this, because I'm sure the words I'm using are not great words to describe these sorts of things. But either way, I mean, maybe if there had been 2, but the fact that there are 3 books that are like this, and potentially more, I don't know, maybe there's more that you all have seen that have the same style, it's a little similar. Also, just to be clear before we keep going, I'm not trying to start anything by claiming like, I think this artist might have copied this person or something like that. Trends happen, and I'm not accusing anybody of anything. I just think it's really interesting to see how it can come up from time to time and be really similar. So the next one, I think it's interesting because these came out within a pretty short amount of time from one another, and that would be Mask of Mirrors and Black Sun. And just like the first example, the imagery is not particularly basic. I mean, we have a very intense looking mask. One, of course, is almost part of the person's flesh. It's like a part of them, whereas the other one is just an extravagant mask on this person's face that I feel like would never be able to actually sit on someone's head. But either way, not only is the imagery itself bold and typically, I would say, unique, although obviously not so much so when they're side by side, but it's also the fact that there's kind of a featheriness to them, like wings on both, and the colors are almost exactly the same. So Black Sun, its colors are more, I would say, bold. That's the thing that I think distinguishes a lot of them from each other, is that one tends to have more subdued than the rest. So this one, to me, despite the fact that it's very similar, I still think the first set I showed, it doesn't help that there were 3 instead of just 2, but also I still think that this one has more unique traits from one cover to the next than the first set I did. One more thing I want to add to this one is that the fonts are very different, and then the colors that they have on the fonts are obviously very different, because one is white, and then with the author it's kind of more blending in, whereas the other one is just like, look at, this is Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. This next one, I will be very curious to know if any of you who like to peruse the fantasy section have ever noticed this. So these covers, in my opinion, don't necessarily look that much alike as far as the formatting, the design of the covers. It's the pose of the character on the cover. So one of them would be The Shadow Rising. This is a book in the Wheel of Time series. We have the character Matt. He's kind of holding his weapon behind his back in kind of like a casual, cool way. And every time I see the book Soul Keeper, which I have not read, I've just happened to have seen it on the shelf, every time I see it, I always for a second think it's like the same artwork as what you see on the Wheel of Time cover, because while it's a different shoulder, it's kind of a very similar pose, and I don't think anything suspicious was going on and that this particular artist was like, I'm just gonna like trace this or something, but I just always have to take a second look whenever I see it. Next up, we have 3 books, just like at the beginning, and these ones all have trees on the cover. I do think that trees are something that you see on a lot of covers, so I'm not faulting anybody for using a tree. I love trees on the covers, but the color scheme and the font of a couple of these are quite alike. So we have Go Set a Watchman, Salvage the Bones, and An American Marriage. So An American Marriage, to me, I would say it looks a little less like the other 2. They all have very similar colors that they're pulling from. Shades of kind of bluish with a hint of teal and kind of green, and then some kind of gold yellow color mixed in. So you don't just have the tree, but you have that. The thing that I think makes An American Marriage stand out a little bit separate from the other 2 is that the font, I would say, is quite different. Perhaps they're not quite that similar to one another. Take a shot every time I say similar in this video. But I still think that these ones, whenever I first see it, I have to take a sec too. I have to take another look. Next up, we have The Girl in the Tower and A Crown of Wishes. These are by completely different authors, but they do both happen to be fantasy. The colors are very different from one another, but the images, it looks like you took the same image and you just zoomed in. And my husband made me laugh when I showed him this one because he was like, it looks like one girl started riding a horse and she kept riding that horse into this other book. So it's not just that the image looks similar, but it's that we have the girl riding the horse, and then if you really look closely, the background, even the shape of the buildings looks kind of similar. Colors are very different. Beautiful covers. I think both of these, they very much stand out without being overly bold. But I also think that the fonts that they chose are somewhat similar as well. I do think that A Crown of Wishes, having that little embellishment around the image, around the whole cover, is very pretty, and it kind of makes it a little more distinct, whereas the other one has that around the title. They're not quite the same, but I did have a good chuckle with how much it does look like we just zoomed in on the girl from the other one. Next up, I actually saw other people point this one out, and as far as the ones that I have on my list here, I don't think they're as similar as some of the other ones we've seen. We have the Queen of Nothing and Queen of the Conquered. So one thing that I feel like is inevitable with these is they both have the word queen in them. So the Q, the font for both of these Qs, it looks pretty alike, and you can't help that both of them have the word queen in it, right? Lots of books have the word queen. But I think the snake and then the color scheme that they have for both of these covers, I can see why people would think they look kind of alike, or perhaps there was some influence or a trend going around. But I think the colors are different enough. There's obviously a big emphasis on the crown on Queen of Nothing, whereas the emphasis on Queen of the Conquered, it's more of how it's going over the person, the human being on the cover. And I don't know. It was really interesting to me that I've not seen other people point out some of the ones I've mentioned already, but I have seen people point this one out. So I wanted to include it in case you've ever thought it too. This one I do think was just a trend going around, but I don't actually think the covers are that similar. Sorry, it's similar. Next up is one that I actually am curious if you would like more books to have this look to them, because I think it's kind of cute. I think it's pretty. And that would be The Downstairs Girl. This is the UK edition, and This Time Next Year. So both of them have really pretty colors to them, and both of them have like the outline of the character, little cutouts to them, and there's something charming about both of these covers. I think there's kind of the background has little bits of like flecks of something. So in The Downstairs Girl, it looks more like plants, and the other one, if I zoom in, I think, yeah, they're little stars. But either way, it's kind of this like speckled look to it, and I think it's pretty. I think that The Downstairs Girl, they're obviously doing a little bit more with the title of it, but both of them kind of have the titles going at an angle instead of just kind of like very obvious, like this is straight right now. I think they look pretty. I don't think they're too alike. I think they're different enough, and I wouldn't mind more books with this trend, although I think that it's going to be difficult because when you already have so much going on with like the cutouts of the characters and these fun embellishments to the covers, I think after a while it's going to be hard to make one of them stand out without getting too intense or limiting it too much to where it looks too simple. But I do like both of these. Next up, we have Winter and Twilight. I've seen these ones compared to one another before. There's somebody holding an apple. And again, it's funny to me that the one I have seen pointed out by other people is not one that I think is all that similar, but again, I wanted to include it in case you feel that too. I just think that the fonts are also very different. The colors are very different. Twilight is more of a... The apple itself, it's funny, you would think it would stand out more because there's not very much else going on. It's just pale person arms and then black. And then Winter, you would think, okay, the apple's not going to stand out as much because the background has more going on. We kind of have that fade effect from this glowy color into the bluish purple. Text is obviously much bigger. The font, there's more to it. But I actually think it stands out more in Winter than in Twilight. Either way, some similarities here, but I think it's just there's an apple on both of them. This next one, if you told me that this was a part of the same series and I just didn't check the author, I would 100% believe you. The font is, it's got to be the same font or a very similar font because it looks so much alike, and that would be Empire of the Wild and The Box in the Woods. So one of them has creepy trees on the cover. One of them has this pattern that kind of goes into something, it shrinks into something. I don't know if that font is used for whatever. I haven't read these books, so I don't know if this is a common font that you see for this genre, or I know one of them I believe is like a mystery, but it's a YA, I think, and so it's not as dark and gritty. And maybe Empire of the Wild is a similar thing going on. But there's something, I mean, they're not even the same colors. One is purple with like reddish pink, and then one of them is browns and blacks with like little tiny hints of purple mixed in. But gosh darn it, I mean, they look so similar. The titles, the placement, the size of the author's name is not exactly the same. One of them it looks like is a slimmer look to it, the Maureen Johnson. But I swear these look like they're in the same series. Save the best for last. I think that these two look very similar, and I know for a fact it's the same artist who did the artwork. So I'm not necessarily saying how dare they use the same artist, how dare this artist have their own style. I just think that somebody should have said, hey, can you perhaps change the colors slightly, the shades? You can keep the same, like the main, it's like reddish orange and then whites. Maybe have the reddish orange look a little bit darker on one, maybe have it more cool tone instead of warm tone, because Cast in Firelight and The Princess Will Save You, these, to me, there's just too many things alike on both of them. So you have the figure in red being kind of the prominent toward the front with the character behind them with it's like the same shade of like white gray. And what I will say is a little bit different is the background of Cast in Firelight. It more of this, the red is matching where the character in red is, the white is matching where the character in white is, whereas the other one is just kind of like an orangey red background. But the colors are so alike. The font is kind of similar, and it also has a similar hue to it. Once again, like Cast in Firelight's a little more orange, The Princess Will Save You is a little bit more yellow, but I think that they should have asked, because this artist is obviously got their own style, which is why they get to do a lot of different art for a lot of different covers in YA fantasy. I'm sure a lot of you even recognize this artist, and I think they're a very good artist, but it has been brought up before that sometimes after a while it looks really similar, and yeah, I think that somebody should have done something. They should have just requested, like, can you tweak the colors? The person in charge of the font maybe should have, I mean, I don't know, because it's possible that this isn't even the same publishing house that's putting out these books, so maybe they weren't even aware. I just think that, you know, these look so alike. If you told me they were in the same series, I would have been like, okay, that makes sense. But they're not, so I feel like a little more could have been done. Let me know which of these stood out the most to you and why. If there are any other books I didn't mention that you think look very alike, I would love to know. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.